Okay, well, I would say that to kick off with, I have been badgering the BBC for about 20 years. Maybe 25 years ago, I realised that there were serious failings with the way the BBC was reporting on climate change. It was downplaying the gravity of the threat and downplaying the degree of scientific certainty that had emerged by the turn of the century. And I worked informally with a number of people to try and exert pressure on the BBC to nudge climate change deniers out of the way. Anti-science climate change deniers, I felt, certainly by the year 2010, they had no place on BBC or ITV because there was no scientific basis for their beliefs. And so I tried to exert pressure on the BBC, ITV, and others to nudge them out of the way, to reduce the time that was given to them on television and radio. And when Extinction Rebellion launched, very early on, it became apparent that a major strand of their work was tell the truth. And so there was a natural overlap between what Extinction Rebellion was doing and what I've been doing. But I do a lot of work independently of Extinction Rebellion on what, if you like, is the tell the truth agenda. Help to contribute. I'm a contributor towards this book, Toxic News, covering climate change. And I regularly lobby the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, mainly the broadcasters, and occasionally I will write to editors of national newspapers. Because of my association with XR, it does kind of help to get their attention if I write to them, and occasionally they'll write back to me and say, we don't agree with you, John, and not give any reasons why. I think it's quite telling that I think the media knows that it's failing miserably, failing the nation very badly, and it won't change. Maybe only give us very small concessions. I have organised a number of demonstrations, some lawful ones outside ITV, HQ, ITN, which ITN makes Channel 4 News, Channel 5 News and ITV News. And that resulted in myself and others being invited in to send as delegates for XR to explain where ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5 were going wrong. I was a delegate for Extinction Rebellion to go and see the BBC. There was a different culture at the BBC. They're very, very defensive. At ITN, they were more open to the idea that perhaps they had been failing and needed to change. So as we were sort of having so many conversations with people within XR, particularly the people who had founded it, it became apparent to me that there were certain themes that were coming out from the radical climate movement. And I tried to distill them down into, if you like, 5 core points. And I'm going to run through those 5 core points this evening. And I think for me, in essence, what this comes down to is that you do not live in a functioning democracy if crucial news is withheld from you that would influence the way you vote and the demands you make of politicians. So I'm going to actually argue here this evening that we don't live in a functioning democracy. I'm going to go a little bit further, and I'm going to argue that the media poses a clear and present danger to UK national security. If we get a chance for a discussion at the end of this, and I hope we do, I wonder whether people will say, that's rubbish, John, you can't justify that. Or people will say, no, that's a compelling argument. Because if it is a compelling argument, then it really does emphasize, I think, the scale of the failings in the media, that there is evidence that the media itself poses a national security threat by suppressing the most crucial news and information, and it undermines our democracy. So the first point I think I'd make, the first truth, if you like, that so many people in Extinction Rebellion and other radical climate groups refer to, is that people are dying right now. We know that they've been dying for a long period of time, and hardly anybody knows the detail, the horrific detail about some of these points. Back in 2012, a Spanish NGO that specialized in the impacts of climate change around the world was asked to compile a report for the United Nations. And they said that 400,000 people a year were being killed by climate change, of which 360,000 were infants under the age of 1 year. It's 1,000 children killed a day. And this was building on work that had been done by the World Health Organization and a few other bodies. And what they were finding was that when there was an extreme weather event, whether it be extreme heat, extreme flooding, infant mortality increased. And their research found that 1,000 infants a day were being killed. So we are killing people at the very beginning of their lives, the most vulnerable people, infants under the age of 1 year. And it's horrific. Don't just simply snuff out a life in an instant, like shooting somebody. A child can perhaps take a few days to be killed. And this is so horrific that nobody talks about it. Even people with the environmental movement find it awkward to talk about it. More recently, coming forward to thinking about what's actually happening today, or over the last couple of years, we're seeing some really horrendous outcomes because of climate change. United Nations and the Red Cross say that 150 million people were impacted by record-breaking drought in the Horn of Africa. 150 million, and 100,000 people were killed. That was the 6th year of failed rains. It was a record-breaking drought. And then it suddenly came to an end, and there was rainfall that damaged a number of villages and killed a number of people. But these extremes of extreme weather events are really beginning to hit the poorest people on the planet and people who've done the least to cause climate breakdown. In Pakistan, a couple of years ago, the record-breaking floods there impacted 33 million people, destroyed huge amounts of crops, livestock, destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes. And 6 months later, there were still over 100,000 people who couldn't return to their homes because inland lakes were so extended and it hadn't drained, and people just couldn't go home. And this wasn't just unique to Pakistan. In Chad, since July of this year and September 2024, over 500 people have been killed by extreme floods, record-breaking rainfall, and 1.7 million people impacted. In Sudan, again, this year, over the last few months, hundreds of thousands of people have been permanently displaced by flooding because after previous floods, people just hadn't been able to return to their homes before the next flood. We're yet to hear what the impacts are of Hurricane Helene in United States of America, in Florida and Georgia and other states. But there is clear evidence there that people are being hit by storm after storm, and they just feel that they can't go back. They cannot return. So we are definitely now in the era of the climate refugee. Now, if the media told the truth, they would talk about this scale of suffering. Say, for instance, somebody goes on TV and says they want to expand Heathrow. If the media was honest, they would say to the CEO, perhaps of Heathrow, the representative, well, look, why are you proposing to expand Heathrow? Isn't killing 1,000 infants a day enough for you? Well, of course, that's never going to happen. The media never puts a tough question like that to a major polluter. If you mentioned you've got people there that have worked with Extinction Rebellion, taken actions with Extinction Rebellion, and we all expect to get tough questions from the media. What about all the disruption you're causing? What about the impact on business? We know we're going to get tough questions. We accept that and we're willing to answer them. But the media never puts a tough question about killing people to a major polluter, whether it be Heathrow or any other business. It could be, right now, currently, there's a lot of arguments going on in the media in the country about should we have solar farms in the countryside? Should we have more wind farms in the countryside? Should we build new pylons to upgrade the grid? Well, of course, you're going to have legitimate arguments about this. You're going to have people who are going to be impacted and other people who are going to say, we need this to decarbonise. And the way the media always describes this is in terms of its government policy to decarbonise, it's the UK's net zero target versus a visual impact or an impact upon farming. Nobody in the media ever says anything about 150 million people being impacted, being forced into hunger and starvation in the Horn of Africa, versus your right to not have a visual intrusion by having certain pylons. close to your house. So it's almost as if black lives don't matter. It's almost as if they have no consequence, because the media's just not even going to talk about them. Their deaths and their suffering have become, excuse me, irrelevant, just ignored. They're not relevant to the conversation. So in angry moments, I sometimes will say to the BBC that black lives don't matter at the BBC. If they did, when you were discussing the expansion of an airport anywhere around the country, you would be talking about the hundreds of thousands of people being killed every year by climate change. And so this is, it's not just the media, the printed media, the newspapers will never make a reference like that. It's very rare indeed to get any of the right-wing newspapers to talk about climate change in the context of some activity, whether it be new ocean cruises or aviation or any other kind of luxury. They just don't want to link that with climate breakdown and the suffering that occurs. So I think the first point that comes out with a lot of speakers for Extinction Rebellion, from the founders of Extinction Rebellion and JSO, was people are dying right now. In their hundreds of thousands and millions of people are suffering terribly through famine and flood, fire and other disasters. So now I want to move on to the second truth, and that is talk about likely impact. Now, these are things that are likely to happen in the near future. Now, if the media told the truth, they would talk obviously about the terrible impacts already happening around the world, but they also need to tell people what the likely impacts are in the near future. And I was thinking that quite often you talk to people in conversation, just generally up and down your street or up and down my street, and they have no idea about some of the points I'm going to mention to you now. Now, a couple of days ago, in Farmers Weekly, there was some research undertaken by a couple of universities in discussions with farmers, and it was published in Farmers Weekly. And farmers were warning that there would be civil unrest due to food shortages caused by climate change within the next 10 years in this country. And I was thinking, I was looking around all over the place. I didn't find anything in the national press, and I didn't find anything on TV news. Now, you'd think that might make it into the I newspaper or the Guardian, but I didn't find it there. I know that papers like the Mail, the Sun, the Telegraph, Express, Times, they're not going to report that. We know what they're like. We know they're not going to report something very alarming. But surely something that concerning should have come out of the Guardian, BBC, ITV, Channel 4 News. But it didn't. In May 2024, the government actually it set up a new website. It was set up by the Conservatives, and almost, as far as I can tell, very reluctantly. It was like civil servants were saying, look, climate change is real, it's dangerous, and there are going to be severe impacts here in the UK. And we need to set up a website so as we can start getting people prepared. And it's the Resilience website. And it was almost like it was just civil servants pressing the government, the Conservative government as it was then, to set up this website. It's called the Prepare website. Again, in the notes that you'll see, you'll have a hyperlink to it. And it advises people that we have to expect more extreme weather events and more disruption, including disruption to our food supplies. And it advises people that they must stock up on certain essentials. Could be batteries, wind-up radio, and bottled water, non-perishable food, and the such like. And it was specifically set up to help people cope with more extreme weather events. But the media coverage of this was absolutely pitiful. As I say, hardly anybody you know, and I assume a lot of people here consider themselves to be well informed. Maybe you don't know it's been set up, but hardly anybody you know will know that it's been set up. And specifically because here in the UK, we are concerned of short-term, significant interruptions to food supplies. On the .gov.uk website, the Environment Agency head gave a speech a year or two ago in which he said that we must adapt or die. And that's in the heading of a page on the .gov.uk website. And his warning was that we're not tackling climate change quickly enough, and we will be hit by very significant increases in temperatures. And if we don't adapt to it, we will die. Now, again, I put it to you, How many people do you know that is on the government's official website? That's the head of the environment saying that we must adapt or die. Now, when I was interviewed, I was a speaker for XR for a time, and on one occasion I was asked to go along and be interviewed by ITV in Whitehall about an action that was taking place there. And they wanted to talk to me about the disruption we were causing. And the second I brought up this thing being on the .gov.uk website, adapt or die, they instantly cut me off. And you can see, I think I've got a link to it somewhere on my Facebook page. I ought to dig that out. I'm going to put that in the paper. But you can actually see that as soon as I say that, they immediately switch away. They don't want to talk to me anymore. Now, a lot of XR speakers will refer to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they will refer to a lot of the research that appears there, which is considered to be very mainstream. This isn't radical. This isn't some fringe publication. This is the world's agreed science. And the IPCC warns that 3.3 billion to 3.6 billion people live in contexts highly vulnerable to climate change. Now, we are on track for, according to the IPCC, perhaps 2.9 degrees Celsius of global heating by 2100. They warn it could be more. There is a risk it could be more than that. But they think it's more likely to be around about close to 3 degrees Celsius. Now, that is one hell of a lot of people who could be forced to move. The World Meteorological Organization has warned that 700 million people could be displaced by the year 2030. That's a huge number of people displaced. The vast majority of those people will be displaced internally. Now, if the media told the truth in this country, say you get Reform UK on the TV, they would be vigorously questioned about their policies on decarbonising the economy. They vigorously oppose decarbonising the UK economy. And anybody questioning Reform UK would say to them, well, look, you are going to drive hundreds of millions of people, perhaps billions of people from their land. You are going to create the one thing you don't want to happen, which is far more people being forced to become refugees, driven from their land, millions of whom are going to try and get to Europe. You are working to achieve the one thing you pretend you don't want, which is mass migration. And this is yet another example of the media going soft on polluters, not giving them the tough questions that I would expect to get in connection with the work that I do. And going on, just thinking about other points about the imminent impacts of climate change, the Lancet produces an annual report. It's called the Countdown Report on Health Impacts of Climate Change, Countdown Report, and warns billions of people will suffer the ill health consequences of climate change. This is predominantly the increased spread of disease. It's extremes of heat, flood, people losing their homes, people suffering because they can't get the medication they need, all kinds of impacts, huge range of impacts that the Lancet identifies. And they produce this report once a year. Again, hardly anybody knows. And the public out there at large, they know climate change, or I'm a bit worried about it. There's a few more floods, we're getting more rainfall in the UK. But they don't know the scale of the threats, that literally billions of people could suffer serious health consequences. Now, when it doesn't get any more serious than killing people. Now, there's peer-reviewed research by two professors, Pearce and Parncup. Now, they reviewed, they're the universities of Graz and Western Ontario. Again, the link is, reference to this is in the paper. They reviewed 180 papers, scientific papers, and they produced their peer-reviewed research, which was peer-reviewed. And they warned that 1 billion people will actually be killed at 2 degrees Celsius of global heating. Now, that's really important because we're not heading for 2 degrees Celsius. We're heading for significantly more than that, close to 3 degrees Celsius of global heating by the end of the century, more the following century. That's an unprecedented level of human suffering and death. The 20th century tyrants, they never contemplated killing 1 billion people or 2 billion people. All of them combined never contemplated killing billions. This is so unprecedented that this warrants being headline news on every news bulletin until the threat of billions being killed has actually been removed. The paper by Pearson Parncutt went further and looked at the number of people killed at 2 degrees Celsius global heating and how much CO2 was necessary to cause that. And they said that 1,000 tons of CO2 emitted equated to one person being killed. So the 1,000 tons limit would be a person perhaps in the UK who maybe lives a fairly lavish lifestyle, maybe flies abroad 3 or 4 times a year, perhaps drives a larger than average petrol or diesel car, maybe has a large house and heats it as much as they care to. So one person, perhaps in the wealthiest 10% of people in the UK, in their lifetime, across their lifetime, they will kill another human being. Again, that is something that we will never see reported in the UK press, because it was reported and regularly reported. It changes politics. It changes the way people behave. And it would appear that the CEOs of ITV, BBC, Director General of the BBC, board members of the BBC, editors of the national newspapers, they do not want their lifestyles to change. So they don't want really difficult news like this coming out. So I'll just go back to that. I'll just say that the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impacts Research, Johan Rockström, one of the directors of the institute, has warned that at 4 degrees Celsius global heating, he believes that around about half the world's population would be killed. It's very difficult to see how half the world's population in the most vulnerable areas could survive what's coming at them. So if that happened by 2100 or shortly after 2100, presumably that's about 5 billion people that would be killed. And I put it to you that that is not beyond the realms of possibility. That is not an extreme fringe prediction. That is one of the real risks that we face. So that's the second truth, the likely impact. The third one is, okay, so we believe that 1 billion or a couple of billion people could be killed, but what is the real chance of extinction? Is there any evidence to suggest that humans could virtually be wiped out? Virtually all life on the planet could be wiped out. I say this because the Mail and the Telegraph have both run articles by, one's Dominic Lawson and the other one's Peter Lilly. And they say there is no peer-reviewed research that backs up Extinction Rebellion and their ludicrous assertions. They both argue and use the expressions to the effect that if it was true, then no level of sacrifice would be unwarranted. That if really billions of people's lives were at stake, then there should be no limits to the amount of sacrifice we make to decarbonise. But they assure readers there is no such evidence. Well, that's simply not true. That's simply not true. Earlier this year, Professor James Hansen is well respected, and other scientists that work with him. He's worked for NASA for years. He published research about the concerns about what he calls, if you like, one of the climate feedbacks to do with albedo in the Arctic and the pace with which the Arctic is heating. And he calls it the energy imbalance. There's several climate feedbacks that he refers to, but in essence, one of the strongest ones in the Arctic, what's happening is that before the ice began to melt, a huge area of Arctic ice was, from space, it appears white from space, and 90% of the sun's energy is reflected back into space when it hits that white sea ice. But as it retreats, it's replaced by black open ocean, which from space appears to be black. And around 90% of the sun's energy is then absorbed. And that is such a vast amount of energy being absorbed by the ocean. It's really driving the pace of heating in the Arctic. And his peer-reviewed research says that this and other climate feedbacks will result in the planet heating by between 8 degrees Celsius and 10 degrees Celsius. It won't happen all this century. It will happen, the quicker we tackle climate change, the faster we do that, it buys us more time. The quicker we decarbonise, buys us more time. But he said that this is such a massive threat that we will have to deploy geoengineering. I'll come back to geoengineering in a moment. But I want to put it to you that 8 degrees Celsius to 10 degrees Celsius of global heating Well, if 4 degrees Celsius kills half the world's population, then we are looking at the majority of people being killed on the planet. Um, it's very, very difficult to see how people can survive that outcome. Now, that science, although it's peer-reviewed, doesn't mean to say that's proven. But there are more and more climate models that scientists refer to as running hot. The Grantham Institute for Climate Impacts Research in the UK, they produced a paper a couple of years ago. Again, it's referenced in the paper you'll have, that warns of a plausible worst-case scenario of 7 degrees Celsius of global heating this century. Now, that is a mainstream scientific body. And it's because we don't know, we don't have a precedent to what we're doing here on planet Earth. We don't know how quickly all these climate feedbacks will hit us, from thawing permafrost that releases methane to forest fires that increasingly are now releasing carbon dioxide into the Arctic, in Siberia, Canada, and also wetlands in the tropics. That because of global heating, there's more microbiological activity, and they're producing more carbon dioxide and methane. A series of climate feedbacks have begun to emerge, and we don't know how quickly they will overwhelm our ability to decarbonize and slow the pace of global heating. So the point I'll put to you here on the third one is that the evidence is clear of a risk, of a threat, of something so extreme happening that we could almost be driven to the verge of extinction. And literally, very many billions of people would be killed. Now, for the media to suppress that, for the BBC and ITV to refuse to report that threat to its audiences is unforgivable. There can be no excuse for failing to report that to people. There can be no excuse that people don't understand the nature, the gravity of this threat. It can't be proven. It's a subject of vigorous scientific debate. But when relatively mainstream scientists are trying to warn the world there's no excuse for the BBC and others for hiding it from people. Because if the people knew that that risk was real and that we had to tackle it as a matter of extreme urgency, then we would, I put it to you, be far more likely to decarbonise at much greater speed. And the people like Nigel Farage, Reform UK, and Donald Trumps of this world would be told, the public would just see, no, you're running too great a risk. I don't want the youngest members of my family to be killed. We're going to decarbonise, and we're going to accelerate the rate at which we decarbonise. Which brings me on to the fourth point. And the fourth point, one I think is pretty obvious from what I've already said, and that is the target of 2050 is far too late. Now, obviously, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil have issued demands for very, very rapid efforts to decarbonise that would obviously transform our lives. That would mean we'd probably have to stop flying. We'd probably have to stop taking ocean cruises. We would probably have to stop driving petrol and diesel cars almost straight away around our towns and cities. And we would live more frugal lifestyles. We'd be healthier because we'd be eating less meat, we'd be eating less fat, we'd be having more exercise, walking and cycling, and we'd probably have happier lives in the process. But there is no doubt about it that if we took really dramatic action to decarbonise, that it would change our lifestyles, and very significantly so. But the point about 2050 being far too late is something that, again, hardly anybody quite understands this. Each country, when they're asked to make their contributions to international targets, they're asked to decarbonise by the year 2050. China and India have said that they won't quite meet that. Hopefully China will, but they're struggling. India, hopefully the politics there will soon change and they'll make greater efforts. But most countries have agreed to try and reach net zero by 2050. But we here in the UK, we only have less than 1% of the world's population. We have 0.85% of the world's population. But we're responsible for 4.52% of global historical emissions. So if you want to allocate a fair share to each country of the emissions cuts they've got to deliver, well, our fair share was used up over 30 years ago. We've already had our fair share. We've used it up. We haven't got a carbon budget. But we did decided that we would pretend we had a carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius global heating. Get this, what we're going to do is we're going to overdraw that budget. What our plan is the UK and Germany's in a very similar position because they industrialized around about the same time we did. We will pretend that we've got a larger carbon budget than we're entitled to. We'll nick part of the rest of the world's fair share of it, and then overdraw on that carbon budget. And we will say that from the year 2050 to 2100, the young have got to pay a vast amount of money to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. All of this is written into what's called the Paris Climate Agreement. COP21 is predicated on the notion that the world will exceed 1.5 at some point around about the year 2030, but we must decarbonise sufficiently quickly and start carbon removal technologies to stay well below 2 degrees Celsius of global heating. That's the words that's used, well below 2 degrees Celsius of heating. And by 2100, we will endeavour to stabilise temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius of global heating by getting the young to pay to take out of the atmosphere all the carbon dioxide we dump into the atmosphere now. Now that's the deal. That's the COP21 agreement. Did anybody agree that with the young? Did anybody tell the young, you know what, we've agreed a deal. You've got to pay for every ton of carbon dioxide we dump into the atmosphere now. Well, I'll tell you what, you go into any school where you live or any school where I live, none of the young people there know. Nobody's telling them, and nobody has any intention of telling them. I have, once every 18 months, 2 years, I write to the BBC board members and ITV board members, every single one of them, executive committee and board. And I make I tell them where they've been going wrong over the last year or 18 months, where they're still continuing to go wrong, and give them examples of the news, crucial news that's cropped up that they suppressed, they should have reported. And I always make the same appeal, and that is that you have to tell the young what's planned for them, because nobody else is. And they always refuse. It's never happened. They've never agreed that the young should be told what the plan is for them. So again, looking at peer-reviewed research, you'll see a link to this. There is a peer-reviewed research in the Anthropocene magazine journal on carbon removal, the cost of carbon removal from the year 2050 to 2100. And it says the cost could be $535 trillion. Very difficult to get your head around a trillion. Very difficult to understand that figure. But if the UK is responsible for 4.45% of historical emissions, it kind of suggests that our share of that, our little UK, might be around £15 trillion, 20 trillion pounds. It's phenomenal. Now, most people in our movement would say the young can never afford to pay that. Carbon removal is very difficult. There are some natural techniques you can use, things like biochar and enhanced weathering and planting more trees, rewilding, but they only draw a relatively small amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And the IPCC and the UK's Committee on Climate Change say we're going to invent great new technologies called things like BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage. We're going to draw the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and we're going to dump the carbon dioxide deep underground. It's going to be permanently sequestered there. Well, obviously, these technologies are only run at a very, very small scale. We know they work, but they're incredibly expensive. The most recent direct air capture plant in France that's under construction now will sequester carbon at a cost of £780 a tonne. There's one being built in Suffolk right now. It will capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at £3,000 a tonne of carbon dioxide. These technologies are, the experts say, the costs will come down in the future, but there's no way they're going to come down massively to make this feasible. But here's the crucial point. If you don't take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and stabilise temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius, then scientists are convinced that all those, the worst impacts of those climate feedbacks will hit us. So far more of the permafrost will thaw, far more carbon dioxide and methane will come out, and we will be overwhelmed by those climate feedbacks. And that is why the 1.5 degrees Celsius target is so important, because although some of those feedbacks are hitting us, they're not hitting us as fast as there is the potential for them to hit us. And if we allow temperatures to go up to 2 degrees Celsius or more, the likelihood is that we will be overwhelmed by those feedbacks. So that's why it's so important that the young cough up, that they pay. If they don't pay, it could be that you could say to them, if you don't pay, you die. So you've got to pay. Except, as I say, the media is determined the young must not be told. So that's why I say the 2050 target is far too late. It doesn't align with the science. And the very fact that we have a 2050 target represents the extreme act of cruelty that politicians and the media and the fossil fuel companies are willing to do this to their own kids, the youngest members of their own families. Now, if we had an impartial media, politicians would be asked about that. The executives of fossil fuel companies would be asked about that. But we don't have a responsible media. We have a media that undermines our national security and undermines the security of every child on this planet. And the fifth truth, when we discussed setting up this talk, I was asked if there was time, we would talk about efforts to use the criminal law to tackle the key climate criminals. And I have a lot of information on that. And if we do have time, I'm very happy to go into this. But I will touch on it now because it's the fifth truth. And that is that people like Gail Bradbrook, Claire Farrell, Zoe Cohen, Phoebe Plummer, and many other speakers with JSO and XR use the words genocide, genocidal, extermination, crimes against humanity. They use that language. And the fifth truth is they're technically correct. They're not being emotive. They may feel they're being emotional, but technically that is correct. Zoe Cohen goes further, and I've heard her often say on TV that what is planned is going to be the equivalent of 100 Holocausts, and she's immediately then shouted down. When Phoebe Plummer said it was represented genocide to annihilate the low-lying island states, she was ridiculed on BBC television. So people are just ridiculed and dismissed. But this is actually technically correct. And it's so important that if your nation engages on an act of genocide or crimes against humanity, a responsible, impartial media would examine that and examine it carefully. Because if you were lying, if what you were saying wasn't true, then media wouldn't hesitate to examine that very carefully so as to prove you wrong. But they're not going to do that because they know that those speakers are right. International criminal law, you're about to become an expert in international criminal law. International criminal law, under international criminal law, there are crimes against humanity and genocide are prohibited by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Now, in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, there are concepts built in there that also are recognised in UK law. Article 25 has what's referred to as common purpose or joint enterprise, where you are pursuing a line that you know it will very likely result in mass suffering, mass death. You may not necessarily hate that person, that group of people, but you know that by pursuing a line of action, you will contribute to that outcome. So if you expand aviation, for instance, that's your policy decision, you know you will contribute to worsening famine in the Horn of Africa. You know that you will accelerate sea level rise and you will wipe out many more low-lying island states. Article 25 of the Rome Statute criminalizes that contribution to. Even if you personally don't go and kidnap a person from Ethiopia, put them in a cell and starve them to death. You personally don't have to have killed anybody. The way the legislation works is you contribute towards an outcome. Article 30 of the Rome Statute tackles two concepts: direct intent and oblique intent. We recognise this as murder and manslaughter. Murder is, I hate you and your people, and I'm going to kill you all. Oblique intent or manslaughter is, I know there's very, very high likelihood that your island will be annihilated and your people will go hungry if I pursue this course of action. but you know what? I want that thing over there. It's burning fossil fuels and the economic benefits it gives me. I want that thing over there. I don't hate you, but you're just going to have to die. And those concepts are both written into the legislation. And that legislation is brought into UK law. It's brought into UK law by the International Criminal Court Act 2001. It's in our law. It's in our legislation. You are not allowed to implement a policy as a politician or anybody else in this country that would result in mass death, mass suffering, and annihilation. Now, there are a number of groups around the world and here in the UK that have discovered this legislation. If you are a signatory nation to the International Criminal Court, you are obliged, as soon as you become a signatory to the International Criminal Court, you have to bring that legislation into your own national jurisdiction. The idea is by having it in your national jurisdiction, you know it prohibits you from causing mass death, mass suffering, and annihilation. Genocide, crimes against humanity. There's a huge range of crimes against humanity, certainly causing mass displacement, causing mass famine, that's in there. Other crimes are in there, like the crime of apartheid. So that is our fifth truth, and that is that this really is genocide. This really is a crime against humanity. And when XR and JSO use that language, they're correct. And if the media told the truth, everybody in this country would know that our nation is committing the most appalling criminal offence. And politicians in this country should have been prosecuted. The UK Youth Climate Coalition, Students Against Climate Solutions, they've got a case at the International Criminal Court against the board members of BP. The group I represent has a case at the International Criminal Court against 5 named senior UK politicians. These cases are thorough, they're well researched and stack up in terms of international criminal law. We have experts in international criminal law who advise these groups, and there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever the legislation is robust, it's clear. The obstacles to this are purely political. So, to sum up this part of our discussion about the media telling the truth, at the outset, I said to you that we do not live in a functioning democracy because the media won't allow the people to hear the most alarming and distressing facts. And I went further and I argued that the media represents a serious national security threat to the UK, because if the people in this country all knew the gravity of the threats, they would demand much more radical action to decarbonise. That in turn would mean that the suffering that we're due to suffer in this country would be greatly lessened. And I'd like to, hear whether people either agree with that or disagree with that, those 2 points. But just as I wrap up now, before we go back to you there in the room, I will say this of the media has stolen from the young the one thing they needed to defend themselves: information. And I'll pause there while we consider now what's been said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So now I suspect there will be some questions or ideas or discussion. Should we give people a couple of minutes to have a think? Or I don't know, anybody's got a question ready that they want to shoot off right now? We're so shocked out of our socks. Tony.
That was great, John, in the worst sense of the word. And I think we understand, don't we? My problem with this is that the issue is that we live in a system of global capitalism, and that capitalism depends upon fossil fuels. Nothing makes profit like oil and gas. So renewables and a green future means the end of the accumulation of wealth in private hands and the amount of profit that the fossil fuels give. But the other thing is just the infrastructure. across the board is so absolutely wedded to fossil fuels,
Yes.
not least plastics and all the rest, that it's impossible to see how capitalism can transition. And I say that because my work on climate is inside the trade union movement. And our trade union congress this month was a fierce struggle on the floor of conference.
Yes.
Between the proponents of gas and oil and nuclear and those of us against it. And we lost marginally. We lost by about 1% of a vote of 5.5 million members. So we'll win next year. But that debate keeps going on because it seems to me you are either putting forward an idea that capitalism can somehow be reformed over time to deal with the climate catastrophe that you've very well spoken about, or you have to be anti-capitalist and say, actually, it's the system, stupid. Everything else is pie in the sky. And either we replace capitalism or indeed we become extinct.
Yeah. When I go into battle with newspaper editors and broadcasters, I don't actually bring that up. If it comes up in conversation, I say that it is perfectly valid conversation to have, that the economic system and values we have in our society need to be discussed and we need to address these issues. But I try to focus upon facts that can't be disputed. Professor James Hansen, fact, he did produce this paper, and it was supported by a number of other professors, not just him. It was peer reviewed. And I argue that there are certain facts that you must not suppress. You have a duty to report. In case of broadcasters, that is in your mandate, and you're failing in your mandate. So I try to not get drawn into things that are much more debatable. There will be people. There's a political party, very small, called the Climate Party. Ed Gemmell runs that. And they put a few people up at the last elections. And they argue that capitalism can solve everything. That capitalism isn't the problem. It's regulation that's needed by the government to mandate the end of the use of fossil fuels. By mandating that and saying to an industry like aviation, it's your job to solve this. And if you can't solve it, well, then you go out of business. So tough regulation by the state, but their argument is, oh yeah, capitalism can solve this. So although I'm a member of the Green Party and it's very skeptical about so much that harm that the big business does, in my campaign work, Tell the Truth campaign work, I try not to get involved in that. Apart from anything else, if you think about the points I made in the first 5 points, I feel like I'm overwhelmed when I read that stuff myself, let alone take on something extra, which is the need to completely transform our economic system. So I agree with everything you say. The points you make are completely valid. All I'd say is that when I'm doing this particular piece of work, I just try to focus upon scientific facts.
I've got Jenny, then Zoe, then Dave. So we've got a question from Jenny now, Jenny Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, John. I have 2 questions actually, if that's okay, but I can just ask one to start with. I was just wondering, do you think it's more important to communicate the information and facts that you spoke to today, or increase media presence of climate solutions and alternative investment opportunities for businesses? Sorry, and yeah, like solutions and ways forward for the community.
Yeah, really important point, because if we terrorize everybody, a lot of people go into despair and they freeze. Some people will just simply say, it's too much for me to cope with, I'm switching off. So what I say to people, if it's a new audience, this audience here tonight is different, because I'm sure the vast majority of people here are very active. and they know a certain amount of the topic that we're talking about, and they're not going to be dissuaded from acting because of what I told you now. But if I go into a completely new audience, particularly young people, I start off by saying, I'm going to tell you something really horrible, and it is horrible, and it is upsetting. And then I'm going to tell you how we're going to fix it. So I give people the horrible stuff, and then I say, I occasionally remind people, because it has happened that I've given a talk and somebody's burst into tears. And then I say, and this is how we fix it. And that is crucial. This idea of solutions are absolutely crucial, because if we don't give people the solutions to this, then they are going to give up in despair. They're not going to try to turn this around.
Yeah, that leads into my second question, because I was going to ask if you have any suggestions of how to communicate the messages, especially to young people, without inducing climate anxiety. And
I think
yes.
that climate anxiety is a completely natural response. And I would say to people that if you are upset or anxious about what I've told you, then you're normal, and you're responding the correct way, which is, this is horrible and it's frightening. But we need to understand that people have actually lived through terrible hardship in the past. People in this country lived through World War II with bombs and gas dropping out of the sky. And we can survive very, very frightening situations. But this is a situation where, if we act now, we've actually got the chance to create a society which is better. And we have got a chance to create a society that's better. We will have disruption to our food supplies. We will have sea level rise. But you know what? We can survive that. We here in this country can survive that. Most of us can survive that if we take the actions that are needed right now. We get on with it. We can begin to adapt to what's coming. Where there are some things that are horrible that we can't put right would be in much of the Sahel region across Africa and the Horn of Africa. There are some countries of the world where people there will be pushed back and back and back, and life expectancy will drop and drop. And maybe at this point of a conversation with young people, maybe I wouldn't focus upon that. I don't know. If you want to give people hope, then you can say, if we decarbonize incredibly quickly, we can reduce the suffering in the global south, and we can create a better society here for us.
Yeah, thank you. That's very
Is that
good.
okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Zoe?
Yeah, I think you've covered a lot of actually my question around your response to Jenny. Yeah, I was just really, I think, yeah, what you spoke about was great and very accurate. I was just wondering about how effective it would be if the media did tell the truth and did repeat these significant statistics every day. Because if we look at, going back to your point, you know, Black lives don't seem to matter, because if you look at the way particular wars are being on the media, maybe not as much as they should be. We look at the situation in Palestine or in Sudan at the moment, which is getting particularly little coverage, but Ukraine, for example, thousands of people are dying, and people seem to just get inured to it and get quite comfortable with the fact that people are dying in other countries, as long as they still get to maintain their lives. So, or just because they are also dealing with their own challenges, and it all seems very far away and very separate. So I guess it's a question of, I think you're quite right in trying to push that they do this, but it doesn't seem to be how the media operate. They have a notoriously short attention span. They loved it when Extinction Rebellion first launched because it was new and it was different. Then the novelty wore off and they wandered off and looked at other things. Nothing changed about what Extinction Rebellion were doing, other than the media were like, well, we've seen that before, so now we're going to go and look at something else. And I think it's the same if they were saying 1,000 children are dying every day. They said that the next day, and then they would be like, well, this isn't news anymore, it's not new. So you'd have to keep coming up with new things. And there is a lot of like great data out there that you could, if they were really decent reporters, be talking about. but I'm just wondering if like getting it on the news is the be all and end all, or whether there's other tactics that could be explored, because it feels like a lot of people are aware, and the people that maybe aren't aware, if it's on the news, they're just going to, as you say, switch off and walk away.
Yeah, I think if we think in terms of Ukraine right now is a good example, it's the same as UK during World War II. And that is that you have a whole country in total warfare, and you could say it's either a propaganda machine, that you are constantly motivating people to step up and do what's necessary, to make the sacrifices that are necessary to beat an existential threat. And we do now know that we face an existential threat. And the everyday story is, I'm going to put it to you, is that climate breakdown is now here in the UK. And the news would go to flooded fields and discuss with farmers, how much are you going to get out of this year compared with 20 years ago? How much are you going to get out of this field? What's going to happen to you as a farmer? What's going to happen to the food supplies? What's happening to potato crops? What's happening to winter wheat and other crops that would, a lot of fields would get 2 crops out of in a year. And farmers will be saying, we're not going to get 2 crops out a year. We'll be lucky if we get half of 1 crop out a year. And then we'll have issues around the heat waves and how many people have been killed. And by actually saying to people, look, this is happening right here, right now to us. And this problem of our food supply is coming right at us. I think that we can motivate people and help people to keep paying attention. We could look at south of Spain, where so much of our fresh fruit and veg comes from, and say, well, look, they're running out of water. And you'd have items on the news on a fairly regular basis about, well, what is the water supply there at the moment? When do the aquifers run out? So what we need is government that actually says to the media, you have to report this in such a way as you inspire people to give of their best, to do what is necessary to see our nation come through an existential threat. And that is what happened in the UK in World War II. We have precedents for it. And that, I argue, is what we need now. We face an existential threat, and our media, if it won't step up to it, then I reiterate what I said before, which is the media is a threat to our national security.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, John. Dave and then Oscar.
Thank you very much, John. I very much appreciate what you do, and I've used your words in court. My question is, I would like to see if you can give a quick overview, perhaps, of use of Climate Genocide Act now arguments in court, not so much as a legal defence, but perhaps a little bit about that, but as a telling truth to power exercise.
Yeah, if the chair's happy for me to do that, do you want me to go on and say something about that?
Yes.
Okay. Right. So the campaign group Climate Genocide Act Now formed immediately after COP21, because a lot of people who attended COP21 were very angry and said it's a genocidal agreement. People there actually were using that kind of language. And we spent a long time sort of researching legislation, because we've just felt a small group of people were working on this, and we felt surely it had to be a criminal offence to kill millions of people. And it took us quite some time before we realised what the legislation was. And we were seeking advice from lawyers, and it was surprising that there was relatively little understanding of this. So on the anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, in November 2019, we arranged for 39 people to go to their local police station and take a dossier of evidence into their local police station and say, we want a criminal investigation into the activities of senior British politicians. And we were learning as we went along. And some police officers were very angry. One person was threatened with arrest if they didn't leave the premises. In most instances, the police said, well, we'll leave it with us, we'll find out who deals with this. And later on in 2019, we'd established that it was a specialist division within the Metropolitan Police. And the Metropolitan Police took the dossier of evidence, and they replied quite quickly, and they said that for there to be any chance of a successful prosecution, there had to be intent to commit the offences. So we said Article 30. Article 30 applies, you've got direct intent in there and oblique intent. And they would never reply. They had no intention of dealing with our point. And you get all kinds of appeal procedures that you can go through. And we followed all those appeal procedures, and nobody in any of the appeal bodies would deal with the fact that oblique intent is written into the legislation. And it was a tremendous sense of injustice that the criminal justice system could just disregard the legislation if it suited them to do so. It got worse than that because we, once you've been through every option that's open to you within a national jurisdiction, you're then entitled to take the case to the International Criminal Court. And they sat on the case for several months. It went to them in January 2021, and they sat on it for several months. And towards the end of 2021, they wrote and said, we don't have jurisdiction, we can't pursue this. So we said, why? And they wouldn't reply. And we tried and pushed every kind of different ways to try and get the ICC to explain their thinking, and they refused. So quite separately, there was another group called All Rise. They were taking a case against President Bolsonaro, and that went to the International Criminal Court. And the ICC accepted that case. Now, that was primarily about displacing the indigenous populations, so that while Bolsonaro was bulldozing the Amazon. But it also had in there climate change element and the elements of direct and oblique intent. But the ICC accepted that. So we thought, right, okay, we've got another paper that the ICC has accepted. Wonder if the thinking at the ICC is changing. And we decided we'd have another go at it. In the meantime, there was something else going on in the UK. And that was all the trials of XR people and JSO people were beginning to work through the criminal justice system. And quite often in a court of law, a judge would lecture somebody from JSO and say, how dare you take the law into your own hands? The law applies to everybody. The law is administered without fear or favour. So every time there was a judge making a remark like that, we wrote to that judge and we told them about our case. And we said, you're wrong. With respect, you're wrong. And what you're saying to JSO and some XR people is factually incorrect. You're telling people that the law is applied without fear or favour, but we have proof that's not the case. And it's relevant to the case that you've just heard in court, because that person would never have taken the action they did if the police had acted upon the evidence that we'd given them. Because if the police had acted back in 2019, they'd have gone to the politicians and said, look, this is really awkward. If you don't stop what you're doing, if you don't stop expanding polluting industries, if you don't decarbonise very quickly, we're going to have to arrest you. We're going to have to commence a criminal investigation. So you're going to have to stop. Now, if the politicians and CEOs of fossil fuel companies had stopped expanding fossil fuel activities and decarbonised at a more rational speed, then nobody in XR or JSO would have taken the action they did. So we gave judges the facts and figures. We told them all about the Seagan case. And it must have caused a lot of embarrassment because the Metropolitan Police, at the very end of 2022, were asked to explain themselves. Up until then, they never wanted to engage with us. They never wanted to explain to us why oblique intent couldn't be prosecuted. And in 2023, they said they're going to get their lawyers to discuss it with us. Now, we have professional legal advice. We have a QC then, now a King's Counsel now, referred to, who gives us very detailed professional advice. It's an expert in international criminal law. So we know we're on solid ground. And it's not just us, a group of people working in our own little studies and bedrooms or living rooms in our own homes. We are given specialist advice. So we went into correspondence with lawyers acting for the Metropolitan Police. It's called the Directorate of Legal Services for the Met Police. And that revealed that several things. They felt that they didn't want to pursue the case because they didn't want to proceed against democratically elected government of the day. And we answered that and said, well, look, you know, there could be anybody that commits genocide, whether it be in Rwanda or wherever it is. And the police are supposed to intervene to stop killing. That's what your job is. If there's a sudden breakdown in law and order, whoever's guilty of it, you have to stop them from killing. They argued that there was a legal precedent on oblique intent that required that there had to be such a high degree of certainty that they didn't feel that we had reached that degree of certainty. So we again referred to evidence from the international, from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UK's Committee on Climate Change, the UK's senior scientific officers, and said these people have reached a degree of scientific certainty that is now in law beyond all reasonable doubt. And if you look at civil cases, it's no longer possible to pretend that climate change isn't real and people aren't being killed. So if you look at civil cases and you look at expert opinion advisors of the British government, we know that we have reached that threshold. And we put it to them that we're very, very close indeed to the direct intent threshold. And we gave them a paragraph on that. And that's this idea that as a politician, it could be, say, a conservative politician who attends international conferences on climate change, a COP conference. You'll go to those conferences and your scientists yourself will have told you that if you carry on as you are and other countries carry on as they are, you will annihilate whole nations and you will drive hundreds of millions of people into hunger and starvation. You know that because your own scientists have told you that. And you then go to those international conferences and you see people there who beg not to be annihilated. In some cases, people have actually said, representatives there have said, what you're doing is a death sentence for my people. The language that's used at some of these conferences is very, very distressing to hear. And that politician will sit there and they will say, but I want all the economic benefits that fossil fuels bring. I want to decarbonise at a pace that suits me, not you. And comes back to their own country and says, this group over here, they'd like to expand aviation. That will increase emissions by tens of millions of tons of carbon dioxide a year, and I'm going to agree that. I'm agreeing that, despite the fact I know with absolute certainty that that contributes to mass death and suffering. So in our legal arguments with the Metropolitan Police, their lawyers, we said that's direct intent. So we're over the oblique intent threshold, and we're now at the direct intent threshold. And there were a couple of other relatively minor points they brought in about individual personal responsibility, and we gave them the references in the legislation to that, and explained to them, gave them examples of recent trials, like in Germany, the most recent trials of genocide in Germany. There was a case of a 93-year-old woman who never killed anybody, but she was convicted of genocide because she was an office clerk at a concentration camp, logging the names of people. And she was convicted on the basis that she contributed. She knew what she was doing, she knew what she was contributing to, and she contributed to it, even though she personally never killed anybody. So we explained that legislation, Article 25 of the Rome Statute, to the Metropolitan Police. And in May of 2023, a Metropolitan Police officer, a chief superintendent, a detective chief superintendent, I won't give his name here, wrote and said, we're not talking to you anymore. And he'd taken the case back from the lawyers acting from the Met. They clearly knew they were wrong, and then they then just wrote and said, we're not dealing with it. And on the 27th of July, there was argument about, well, look, who's dealing with it? So are they dealing with it or are you dealing with it? That took a month to resolve. The date is important. On the 27th of July, 2023, we wrote to the Metropolitan Police and they were given bullet points. Everything was broken down in what's called a pre-action protocol letter. It's a legal process. And their case was in absolute tatters. And we sent that to every judge. Copies of that were sent to every judge that ever heard a climate protest case. And it was devastating, but very, very interesting. Up to now, the criminal justice system is just carrying on. They're carrying on prosecuting people despite knowing that the police have perverted the course of justice. And they carry on in the hope that eventually that we will just run out of steam. But something far worse is actually happening and beginning to unfold now for the criminal justice system. And that is, we're not the only ones. The UK Youth Climate Coalition, I mentioned earlier, has brought a case directly to the International Criminal Court, and they are seeking the prosecution of the members of the BP board. The ICC has accepted the case. They're not acting on it. They just got it marked as pending, but they're not acting on it. In the United States of America, that has a different jurisdiction, there's a group called Global Citizen, and they are seeking prosecutions against individual members or CEOs of fossil fuel companies. In France, a few weeks ago, a group called Bloom Association has taken a case to French prosecutors seeking the criminal prosecution of the board members of Total Energies, their biggest fossil fuel company. And they're seeking reparations from those companies for the harm that they've caused. And Bloom Association and other NGOs have met with our groups and the others that I mentioned, and they've made it clear that their intention is to get a case from every single European Union country going to the International Criminal Court. So one case against the major polluter, a carbon major in every country, or it could be politicians. And every couple of weeks, there's another Zoom call, more people join it. Recently, the World Council of Churches joined that meeting, and they said Nuremberg-style trials in connection with climate change are inevitable. This is coming. Amnesty International was part of it, and they're looking at getting all representative groups from all the countries where they operate to develop cases. This is coming. This is coming right at the UK's criminal justice system. I'm going to predict to you that the day is not too far off. It is still years, but the day is not too far off when every single person who had been convicted of an offence in connection with climate protest, all of those convictions are going to be quashed. Those people will be seen as having been on the right side of history. More than that, they were completely innocent. And that is what is coming at the criminal justice system. I'm 67 years of age. I may not see it happen, but I think there'll be a lot of people in their 60s who will see it happen. A lot of people alive today now, even relatively older people like me, in our lifetimes, we are going to see justice. We're going to see the major polluters dragged into a court of law. They will be prosecuted, and they not only will they face imprisonment, but they will have to pay for the harm they've done. I think this is one of the most powerful aspects of our movement, and that's a use of the criminal law. I urge everybody just to look at 3 articles of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Again, the reference is in the document I've given. Article 25, that's about shared responsibility. Article 30 is about direct intent and oblique intent. Article 75 is about the requirement to pay reparations for what you've done. This is happening. This is coming. I think it's the most powerful thing that we've got in our movement. And I urge everybody to familiarise yourself with the cases. Not too complicated to familiarise yourself with the basics. And the sooner major polluters and politicians realise criminal prosecutions are coming, I firmly believe that most of them will change. If you know that you've broken the law because the law is clear, and you know that prosecutions are coming, surely it does suggest that most people would say, no, this is too dangerous. I'm going to change my policies. So that was the second part of the talk that I've been asked to give tonight, and clearly I have just about got enough time to do it. So thank you for that question, and thank you for the opportunity to explain it to people. So have you got any questions on that point?
Yeah, thank you for the explanation, John. I think we have room for one last question because I know Oscar had his hand raised.
So
Is that all right, John? Just one last question?
Yes, absolutely.
Obviously, you speak very well on this. I find it notable that you were specifically talking about the his dam. Like you spoke a little bit on his damage scores. Here are the solutions. but I kind of know when you talk about sort of the media and the criminal justice system. What, like, in general, when you talk to a wider audience, what do you think we should focus on in terms of like rhetoric and what to advocate for in that? Because obviously, I think most in our public know about the solution, they know about the damage climate change cause, but criminal justice and media is a lot more notable and novel. Like I said, that's it's
just struggling a little bit to hear every word you say. I think if I understand your point correctly, to put this as succinctly as possible, I think it's better to use the UK Youth Climate Coalition case and our case, the CGAN case, second. UK Youth Climate Coalition first, ours second. And to say that there are cases now that have been accepted by the International Criminal Court that will result in the criminal prosecution of individual politicians and board members of the major fossil fuel companies. These prosecutions are coming. Therefore, it is absolutely essential that you change your policies now, because that will determine the length of prison sentence you have to endure and how much you have to pay in reparations. You want to keep it as simple as possible, but the most powerful thing is to say, this is coming. It is inevitable, entirely foreseeable. You know this is coming at you because it's the law and it's clear. And if we all use language very similar to that, so that politicians and media figures know that this is coming at them, then the sooner the penny drops, the sooner they will stop. Oscar, Oscar, do you feel that? I wasn't sure I heard every word you said. Do you feel I've answered your point?
Yes, I was asking for like what's a good focus effectively. Yeah. So can you like repeat the two? You mentioned number one and number two. Your case.
So UK Youth Climate Coalition, their case has been accepted by the International Criminal Court. It's against BP, and it's the board members of BP, the named board members, and they not only seek criminal prosecution, they seek reparations, that they've got to pay for the harm they've done. The Climate Genocide Act now case has gone back to the International Criminal Court, but ours is seeking criminal prosecutions. Ours isn't quite as good as theirs because we didn't think to use Article 75 and seek reparations. So the strongest of the cases is UK Youth Climate Coalition, and I always say use theirs first. But all of them are great. And the latest one, as I say, is Bloom Association in France. That case at the moment is sitting with their internal prosecutor, who will be thinking, how the hell do I get rid of this?
Thank you, John. Giovanna Giovanna, can you put your question in like 1 minute, because we're nearly out of time?
Hello, yes, thank you. John, I completely agree with you around the responsibility of the press. And I love what you say about politicians and CEOs of fossil fuel companies prosecuted in the future. And I hope that, editors of the press will also be amongst those people, because they have all the power and no responsibility. In fact, I often think they are the worst criminals, really. And I just want to very quickly make a bit of a plug, really, John, if you don't mind, and everybody. Insulate Britain, you know about Insulate Britain, they don't get mentioned very often now. But a lot, some of us did tell the truth and went to prison for telling the truth in a court of law where we were being essentially gagged. Those trials that were under that judge were removed from him, and they're starting again next week on the 7th of October, 12 trials, some of them retrials. The CPS wants a second attempt at finding some of us guilty, but do look out for that. And if you're not already following the Insulate Britain page, please do, because we need all this moral support that we can get. We're still going at it. And if ever climate activists are kind of, whatever the word is, their criminal records are removed and their fines are paid back. Let's hope all the injunction fees that we've had to pay out are paid back as well. That would be excellent. So, John, it's just been so amazingly interesting. So it's not really a question. I just wanted to make a plug for it. All my comrades in Insulate Britain.
Let me make two very brief points. One is that we offer a witness statement that people can use in court. so that we give our evidence to Insulate Britain people, JSO people. So if anybody wants to use that witness statement, you're very welcome to email me, and I'll get that to you. And the second point is that CGAN has developed a second case, and that is against the Telegraph Media Group that was submitted to the police, and that runs to 120 pages and 2,559 items of evidence. So we are meticulous. We do produce very, very detailed and robust cases. And our second case is just beginning to work its way through the procedures, but that will be against the Telegraph Media Group for inciting these crimes.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I'm just impressed and overwhelmed by what you do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I will get that witness statement from you for when I go in. Thank you.
Please do.
Yeah.
Thank you, Giovanna, and we'll note that date. And John, I think it just remains for us to say thank you so much. That was so incredible, so detailed, so informative. And I think I can speak personally in saying we're in awe of the work you do. It must be exhausting. All that you do every day, tirelessly. It's amazing. And I would, if anybody doesn't follow John on Facebook, I would highly recommend it. It's really, really informative.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having me.